Mr. Brown, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh.
I wanted to start by asking, if I may, about the response that we've seen to this current economic crisis and health crisis as well. When you look at the speed, the size and the scale of responses from governments and central banks, UK and US, have you been impressed so far?
I think the national response has reflected the urgency of having both a medical and an economic emergency at the same time. But when you look at the international response, which has prompted this letter that is signed by more than 200 people today to the G20, it has been very poor. And I think we've got to show now why it is necessary that the G20, which is after all the premier organization for international economic cooperation, should meet as soon as possible, and certainly not delay meeting as it plans until late November this year, and deal both with the health crisis, where we need to avoid a second wave, and particularly one coming out of Africa and the developing countries, and on the economic side, when you need global coordination to move from what you might call the rescue operation. That's what we've been involved in, saving companies, helping people keep their income, putting money into health, to the next phase, which is actually the planning of a global recovery. And on that, I think every country needs to be able to work together so that we can restore global trade, as well as maximize the stimulus that can come from countries working together.
How worried are you, Mr. Brown, about the impact on various emerging markets without this coordinated international response that so far you feel is lacking?
I think it's desperate, because I think what's happening is the number of cases is still rising around the world. It was running 2 days ago at 1 million cases extra every week. I think also the 100 countries that I know and more have been applying to the IMF for emergency help. We know that 400 million more people will go into poverty. 260 million more people will suffer from malnutrition. And we know that unless we act, these countries are not only in danger of having a long recession, indeed in danger of going into depression, but equally at the same time, they cannot, without our help, solve their immediate health problems, and they become a danger to the rest of the world if disease comes back from these countries into countries like America and into the rest of Europe. So there is an imperative for the G20 to come together, to agree a recovery plan, and to agree to cooperate more intensively to prevent a second wave of this disease.
You mentioned there the G20 being delayed till November. The G7 has now been pushed back as well. And most recently as well, President Trump has withdrawn the US from the WHO. Can there be an international coordinated response that as you say, is needed without leadership from President Trump and the United States?
America has always led. In a unipolar age after 1990, America preferred to act multilaterally. Now we're in a multipolar age, and it's undoubtedly the case there are many centers of power and influence. America seems to want to act unilaterally, and we've seen the leaving of the WHO, but also, of course, the leaving of UNESCO, the breach in the Iran treaty, the climate change treaty being pushed out, SALT, the treaty. All these things show that President Trump has been, if you like, putting the ideology of America first into global action. We need now to dissuade him and his administration from this. I think they know that they need to help avoid a second round of the disease around the world. I think they also know that unless the vaccine, when it comes, and the treatments, when they're available, are distributed right across the world, we cannot eradicate the disease. If we eradicate it in one country, but not in other countries, it is still there to come back to haunt us. And I think they will begin to understand, as you look at the trade figures, but you also look at the impact on the American economy, that you will need some form of global cooperation to get growth back to the level it was before the virus hit us. So in all these areas, I think it's the duty of the other G19, if you like, to persuade the America administration that we need to act globally. And I would look to Britain and the rest of Europe to persuade President Trump that to hold an event with only 10 countries invited to the White House is really to divide the world and not to unite it at a moment when the verdict of history will be very harsh if we fail to get our collective act together.
I wanted to pivot, if I may, Mr. Brown, from the lack of an international response and just specifically at the scale of monetary and fiscal stimulus we've seen in the last couple of months, and whether you fear whether it's going to significantly distort market pricing in the long term, coming just a decade, of course, after another bout of significant monetary easing. Do you think there are long-term implications for the market now mispricing risk over the long term?
I think things have changed substantially since 10 years ago. You know, I argued for a fiscal stimulus in 2009, and I think we were punished very heavily in Britain and in Europe because austerity then became the name of the game after we left office. And it wasn't fashionable to think that a Keynesian solution that to create demand in the economy because nobody else could do it was in any way forward, even to deal with the immediate situation after 2010. I think attitudes have now changed, and I think the fiscal expansion is seen as necessary even by people who are on the right of politics and not just on the left. I think people know that interest rates are low and therefore the cost of running a deficit is low. But I think people also know that there is a limit to monetary action in the longer run. You can use it to create liquidity, but you need this fiscal response in the longer run. So what governments are going to have to get used to is managing the debt that they've created, and that will lead to a major debate in every country about what is the right plan for the way forward. The question then is inflation going to recur in the economy? At the moment, it looks unlikely, but of course, if you create such new amounts of new money, there is always a danger of it coming back.
Mr. Brown, I wanted to ask you about Hong Kong. 7 former UK foreign secretaries, including your former close colleagues, Jack Straw and David Miliband, today co-signed a letter saying that the UK had a, quote, moral and legal responsibility to the people of Hong Kong, end quote. Do you agree?
I think what they're proposing is the right thing, to bring together countries that want to see the agreement that led to the changeover in Hong Kong in 1997, to see that agreement fully implemented. And of course, the issue in that agreement that worries people is freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. When I was Prime Minister, had a human rights dialogue with China. I think we need to extend that human rights dialogue. I think we need to raise the fears that we have. And of course, that is a distinct issue from the issue of security, which is the reason why the Chinese authorities are claiming that they're acting at the moment. So I favor the initiative that is being taken. But I would say one thing. We're in a major health and economic emergency. And there are going to be differences on trade, on currency, on the future of Hong Kong, differences on Huawei as well, the technology company. But we cannot afford not to cooperate on issues that affect the future of people's lives and livelihoods in this medical and economic emergency. And whatever differences there is between America and China, between Europe and China, we simply have to understand that we need to cooperate to get through this economic and medical emergency.
And Mr. Brown, I totally understand that. I mean, it's interesting how views on China have changed since the decade you left office. Do you trust President Xi Jinping? Do you trust his intentions, not just for China, but for the world?
When I last met President Xi in London, when he was in London some time ago, he said to me that China had 2 objectives. The first was to avoid the middle income trap. And of course, that is China's desire to become a high income country, what he calls the Chinese dream, to get to the levels of income that have achieved in the West. And that is his major economic objective. The second thing he said was he wanted to avoid what he called the Thucydides trap. And of course, if you look back to ancient Greece, the Thucydides trap is a rising power challenging an established power. Now, whether you accept what President Xi is saying or not, I think it is in the Chinese mind that it is not in their interest to have a prolonged, long-term confrontation on every single issue with the power that is most established at the moment. And I think we've got to see these debates in some sort of perspective. Of course, there's bound to be tension between these countries. There is tension on who is going to be the major and more important technological power. But we've got to find also a way of working together to solve problems that, if the world does not come together, cannot be solved at all. And the most obvious example of that is the control of an infectious disease. If you can't control it in one continent, you will not control it in any continent. And it's also true of this economic recovery. If we can't find a way to restoring at least a lot of the world trade that has been lost, and we cannot find a way of cooperating on a fiscal and monetary stimulus together, then the recovery will be less successful than it should be. And lives will be lost when it comes to the medical emergency, and livelihoods will be lost when it comes to the economic emergency. So I think we should put the problems that we have today in some sort of perspective and realize that cooperation is going to be necessary in the long term, and we've got to find a way of making that work.
Do you accept, though, Mr. Brown, that it's legitimate that global trust in China and President Xi has fallen from where it was when you left office?
Well, when I left office, you've got to remember we were dealing with a global financial crisis. China had decided at that point that they would join the G20. I wasn't absolutely sure when we started the moves that led to the creation of the G20 out of the G7 that China would be prepared to join. India joined, the rest of Asia joined, Africa joined. So at that point, we were at the height of international cooperation. I realized that every country, not just China, retreated into their national silos after 2010. And so we had immigration issues, we had building walls, we had control of, obviously, of tariffs and trade becoming a huge issue as well. The problem now, as I see it, is that we have moved from a defensive nationalism, which is protecting yourself, protectionism, if you like, to an aggressive nationalism. It's us versus them. It's countries thinking that they don't succeed unless it is at the expense of others. It's inventing enemies sometimes even when they don't exist. And I think we've got to stand back and look at what is the future of the world if we cannot find a basis of cooperation. Do we then move to one world, two systems? Do you have a separate IMF? Do you have a separate World Bank? Do you have a separate currency arrangement that splits the world? Do you have a splinter net? I think we've got to think very carefully about what the implications are if we can't find a basis of dialogue. I remember this story of Reagan and Gorbachev when they met in the 1980s. They were to meet at Reykjavik. They met before in Geneva. And President Reagan, who was always interested in Hollywood and Star Wars and everything else, he said to President Gorbachev, "What would you do if we were attacked from outer space? Would you support us? Would you help us?" And Gorbachev said, of course I would. And Reagan said, we too. And he found a basis on which at least they could talk to each other about how they could work together, at least in dealing with the problems where they shared an interest in getting a solution. And of course, that led to the International Space Station in the long run, where Russia and America are still cooperating in space, despite all the tensions in the rest of the relationship. We must now find a way in which we can cooperate at least, particularly when so many lives are at stake in this medical emergency. I think it's very important that I can criticize China, I can criticize the human rights record, as I've done in the past, but I think the most important thing that we've got to do is to find a way of cooperating to deal with the current emergency and then see where we are after that.